Welcome to this explainer. So, when we picture Vikings, we usually think of them raiding the freezing, rugged coasts of northern Europe, right? Well, today we're diving into a completely surreal historical collision. We're going to look at how a freak weather anomaly actually blew a fleet of Norse raiders entirely off course, plunging them into this brutal, epic clash with the highly organized Umayyad Emirate. It's essentially the ultimate story of unstoppable, brute force crashing headfirst into an immovable, hyper-organized military machine. To really grasp the sheer shock of this event, I want you to picture the date, November 11th, 844 AD. At this time, the Andalusian Peninsula in southern Europe was this sun-drenched land filled with peaceful olive groves, sprawling orange orchards, and these incredibly luxurious royal villas, especially around the wealthy, vibrant city of Seville. I mean, this place was a bustling center of extreme prosperity and high culture. The people living in this paradise had absolutely no clue that icy Arctic winds were currently brewing deep in the ocean, and they definitely didn't know what kind of living nightmare those winds were about to blow right onto their shores. The environmental trigger behind this whole invasion is just absolutely wild. Late in the autumn, freezing air rushing down from the Arctic violently collided with warm Atlantic air. This spawned massive, powerful counterclockwise depressions, basically a freak Atlantic superstorm. And the towering mountain ranges of North Africa and Spain acted kind of like a giant funnel for it. This angry freezing storm system essentially grabbed the Viking fleet, pushed them straight through the Strait of Gibraltar, slammed them onto the Iberian coast, and then blew them right up the inland riverways. Now, this was not a slow encroachment by any means. The threat escalated at a terrifying pace. Driven by that freak storm, the invaders first hit the shores of Lisbon, and they sacked the city for 13 agonizing days. Leaving it completely in ruins, they swept further down the coast, ravaging the region of Cadiz. Then, just weeks later, they boldly sailed right up the Guadalquivir River and actually built a forward operating base on a sandbar right at the doorstep of Seville. From the open ocean to the very heart of the Emirate, the sheer suddenness of this attack was totally paralyzing. 50. That's the number of Viking longships that silently materialized on the shores of Lisbon to kick off this rampage. 50 ships, carrying a highly mobile, deeply intimidating force of Norse raiders. For the people living in this region who had quite literally never seen anything like these fast, shallow draft vessels, let alone the fierce warriors inside them, it was an unprecedented shock. These 50 ships were a terrifying vanguard, and they were about to plunge the entire region into absolute chaos. But here is where the story takes a massive pivot. Sure, the Vikings had achieved total surprise, but they were about to awaken a sleeping giant, 16,000 heavily armed Andalusian troops. You see, as soon as reports of the darkness falling on the coast reached the capital of Córdoba, Emir Abd al-Rahman II swiftly mobilized a massive, highly disciplined military response. He didn't just scrape together a local militia, he dispatched his absolute top-tier commanders. The raiders were no longer facing off against unprepared villagers. No, they were about to face the devastating, coordinated might of a state military machine. To really understand the sheer scale of this conflict's bloody climax, consider this number, 1,500. In just a single devastating clash later in the campaign, 1,500 Viking raiders would lose their lives. This wasn't just a minor skirmish, guys. It was a wholesale slaughter that effectively broke the back of the entire invasion. But how exactly did we get from 50 silent ships arriving in stealth to 1,500 dead raiders lying on a battlefield? Well, to understand their downfall, we have to look at the hubris of the invaders. For weeks, they operated with unchecked arrogance. They honestly believed they were totally invincible. They sacked Lisbon, they ravaged Cadiz, and they engaged in massive, brutal human trafficking. The historical sources actually detail how women and children from noble families were abducted, dragged into the dark corners of the longships, and shipped off to the open sea to be sold in European slave markets or hauled back to Scandinavia. Their rampant cruelty and their unchecked early success completely fueled a deadly overconfidence. Enter their absolute worst nightmare, the Northern Frontier Cavalry. Commanded by the notoriously rebellious but brilliant General Musa ibn Musa al-Qasi. These guys weren't your average foot soldiers. They were elite, heavily armored shock troops who spent their entire lives fighting highly structured Christian armies in the north. They rode in these incredibly tight, closed formations. And what is absolutely terrifying about their tactics is that their massive momentum literally prevented them from taking prisoners. If they slowed down to capture someone, they'd break formation and risk their own lives. So for the Vikings, facing a force designed to simply crush everything in its path without stopping was going to be a fatal shock. So, at Taliata, the overall commander, General Issa, laid a brilliant tactical trap that perfectly exploited that Viking overconfidence we talked about. First, he sends in a small, light cavalry unit to poke the marching Vikings and fake a panicked retreat. The Vikings, who are drunk on weeks of easy victories and massive arrogance at this point, took the bait instantly. They literally broke their own defensive shield walls to chase the retreating horsemen, and then the trap snapped shut. General Moose's heavy, armored northern frontier cavalry ambushed the now completely disorganized raiders with a deafening war cry, smashing right into their broken lines. This clash perfectly highlights a stark asymmetry in military capability, and it shows exactly why the tactical advantage firmly belonged to Al-Andalus. Think about it. You have Viking raiders relying on river-long ships, unarmored combat, and these undisciplined, terrifying charges. And they are going up against a highly complex, layered military machine. The Andalusians brought structured light infantry, regional archers, heavy shock cavalry that acted basically like a medieval tank division, and advanced incendiary weapons. It was a completely asymmetric matchup once the Umayyads fully mobilized. It was brute force meeting organized science. And the Andalusian forces didn't just win on land, they actively cut off the retreat. While the heavy cavalry was busy crushing the Vikings on the battlefield, General Issa unleashed Greek fire against the Viking fleet anchored in the Guadalquivir River. Of the 80 longships they had amassed by that point, 30 were instantly turned into floating infernos, just burned completely to coal. Any raider who tried to jump into the water to escape the flames was either drowned or killed by soldiers waiting on the riverbanks. Their primary means of escape was quite literally going up in smoke. The aftermath of this failed invasion was, well, it was incredibly brutal. Cordoba wanted to send an undeniable message. Following the emir's strict orders, 400 captured Viking leaders and notable figures were executed instantly. Their heads were severed and actually sent as grim gifts to allies in North Africa, and many bodies were hung from trees in Seville and Taliata as a really stark warning to any future invaders. Meanwhile, the surviving raiders found themselves completely trapped on the river. The Andalusian navy blocked their escape by water, and the army cut off all their supply lines from the land. Trapped, freezing as the bitter winter set in, and slowly starving to death, the remaining raiders were utterly humiliated. In a massive departure from their terrifying warlord persona, they literally begged for peace. These once fearsome conquerors offered to hand over every single prisoner they had taken and return all their stolen loot in exchange for just one thing: enough meager food and a few warm clothes to survive the long journey back to their homelands in Scandinavia. The emir accepted the deal, and the shattered remnants of the fleet limped away. You know, history so often remembers the Vikings as these invincible, mythic conquerors who just raided Europe with absolute impunity. But this event, it forces us to rethink that narrative entirely. Because what actually happens when unstoppable hubris meets an immovable, hyper-organized state? Well, in Al-Andalus, the Vikings encountered a sophisticated military machine that not only absorbed their shock, but engineered their total destruction in a humiliating defeat. It's a fascinating, lesser-known chapter of history that challenges everything we think we know about the Viking Age. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history you think you know.